pretty sensitive, so I don't think it has to be right in front of your face. I think it's, yeah. So you don't have to have it right in front of you. You can even just turn it.
I'm good. How are you? Willenbrock.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us and being a part of the Beverly Public Schools Community Conversation. I'm Andre Morgan. I serve as the Director of Opportunity, Access, and Equity. Our conversations bring stakeholders together to address pressing issues that are facing several members of our community, including our students, teachers and staff, community, and then public education collectively. As part of our overall community outreach and engagement program, the community conversation is really a valuable tool to help nurture the types of collaborations that are really necessary to move the needle in every person's right to be included in Beverly Public Schools and in the Beverly community collectively. Please allow me to introduce our panel this evening, starting at my far right, your left, Elodie LaPointe, student here at Beverly Public Schools. Iman Patel, also a student here at Beverly Public Schools. Paul Casey, teacher at Beverly High School. Olivia Ehrenberg, also a student at Beverly High School. Brayden Willenbrock, also a student here at Beverly High School. And Reginald Pittman, teacher here at Beverly High School. If you've joined our prior conversations, you know that we have generally had a diversity of members who join our panel. And we thought we'd do something a little different in this community conversation, and that is to make it very high school centered, if you will. And since there are a number of issues that our community conversations have touched on in our prior discussions, they've all kind of related in some way, shape, or form to our high school community. And so we thought it would be an interesting thing to bring our high school community together to explore some of the things that we've heard in our prior sessions. While each panelist will have an opportunity to answer a number of questions that I'll be asking, every panelist isn't going to be expected to address each response. And so in the interest of time, there'll be a series of questions that'll be asked where we'll have a diversity of responses. And then we're going to reserve the final 15 minutes for our audience to ask questions. We know that there are a number of you who are joining us virtually. We certainly want to hear your opinions, your comments, your questions. And the last part of this session will be an opportunity for that participation. For those of us who have joined us in person, you also have that opportunity to ask questions as well to any of the panelists and also to me if it applies. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with our community conversation this evening. There will be 3 tiers from which we will ask questions. The first one is intentionality of race equity work and being anti-racist. The second area is climate, and that includes the school district and the city. And then the third is reach and impact. How do we reach other people, and what type of impact do we want to have? So let's start with the intentionality of race equity work and being anti-racist. Again, as we ask the questions, for those of you who have a particular interest in answering a particular question, we ask that you just go ahead and jump in so that our viewing audience, our virtual audience, can hear your responses. We're going to ask you to pass the mic up and down so that folks can hear you clearly. All right. First question, how do you respond to community members and families who question why we are intentionally creating programs and policies to dismantle racial inequities? Let me ask that again. How do you respond to community members and families who question why we, Beverly Public Schools, are intentionally creating programs and policies to dismantle racial inequities?
Lead off, Dr. Morgan. Thank you for having me. The question is, why are we intentionally creating programs and policies to dismantle racial inequalities? It's important to level the playing field. When you intentionally create programs and policies, that's saying to the community that you care. You want to make sure there's access and equity of all students and people of color, people in the community. So you want everyone to have access to everything that's available in the community. So you're making a statement when you make a statement, you're just putting yourself out there, putting one foot in front of the other, and saying that you care about the community. Thank you.
Other thoughts?
So I guess I would question back as to why wouldn't we want to create programs that dismantle racial inequities? You know, we need to identify that there are racial inequities in our community and in other communities in our nation, as well as other inequities, economic inequities, for instance. And I would think that most community members would want equity within their community on a number of different issues, including race.
All right, many thanks. And I want to round this out by hearing from one of our students, as we have 4 on the panel. How do you respond?
Personally, I think when you lack knowledge, it's very easy to be scared of what you don't know. And by putting programs like this in place for people who tend to lean more towards the inequity part of the conversation, you offer an opportunity to make everything more heard, make every opinion well received on the other end. And I think by setting up these programs, you offer an opportunity to do that.
Any final comments? All right, we're going to shift to our next question. Is it important to address race personally and individually before trying to understand it as a group or on a societal level? Why or why not? Is it important to address race personally and individually before trying to understand it as a group or on a societal level? Why or why not?
I can take it. I would say that personally it is important because if we start with ourselves and try to figure out what our own biases and prejudices may be that we have internally, and if we're the root cause and we want to try to figure out what we can do to improve our outlook on race and how we perceive race and how we treat people of other races, then once we reach that point, that is when we are able to go and talk in a wider group and be able to further educate and share our own experiences to try to pass along that message. And once we have more of that foundation, it is easier for other people to understand the points that we are trying to get across when we are trying to improve equality for race.
Other thoughts?
I think that in order to understand it at a group level, you need to understand it individually. And not everyone's examples or experiences with race and racial inequality and inequity is the same. And noticing that on a personal level and seeing the common denominators between all of them will help you understand it at a group and a societal level.
All right, other takers.
Just to piggyback on that, just want to add just a couple of things, piggyback on that. I think success always starts with the person in the mirror. Anything that you want to accomplish, it starts with the person in the mirror. So anytime that you want to reach out to the community, it's going to start with the person in the mirror.
As we shift, if you will, from intentionality around race equity work to climate, both in the school district and in the city, one of the things I want to reference is the fact that there's a national conversation that many of us have been made privy of. Turn on the news, you see it. When you read an op-ed, you'll read about it. But this national conversation says that race and politics shouldn't be discussed in any school or in any classroom, particularly public schools. Do these conversations belong in our schools and in our classrooms? Why or why not?
So as a U.S. history teacher here at the high school, race and politics are intertwined in our curriculum. A US 1 teacher, teach the American Revolution through all the way up to World War I. So we have a number of topics that, again, involve politics and race. And I always kind of look at a school as a place where students can be delivered facts. They can be delivered a number of different sources in order for them to kind of figure out the history behind why we're in certain places we are as a nation, and then what to do moving forward with that information. And I'm going to get a little bit more of history talk here, but we talk a lot about the Constitution, and when the Constitution was developed, it was developed as a non-perfect document, which I think might not be correct English, but that's okay. But it was done so it could be fixed, so it could be changed. And the only way that we can change our society and make it better, and continuously make it better, is to understand the past, and understand, not only the successes of the past, but also the failures of the past. And any nation in itself, and school, and an education platform that doesn't examine the failures is going to look at itself as not needing to be fixed and not needing to get better. And I think when we talk about race and politics in schools, we can look at the past and look at successes that have happened in a society, and also look at failures that have happened in a society. And those some things we did were successful, we want to do those things again. And if some of the things that we did as a society, as a nation, as individuals were failures, well, we want to change that and make it better.
Other thoughts? Do these conversations belong in our classrooms? Or should we not be having them at all?
I think that we should be having them because it gives kids the ability to talk about these issues that they might not be able to talk about, like at home or in a family setting, because everybody's families are different, right? So being able to, instead of having the familial pressure to conjoin or be part of how they believe, right? They're able to get the information that they need to get to form decisions based off of facts and instead of opinion. And you can get that from having these types of conversations in class, I believe.
Other thoughts?
I think that these conversations should be had in classrooms because it's very easy to have one person's history and only know it is yours, and you tend to lose a sense of self. I think specifically for African Americans, it's very easy to do that because we're being taught this majority history and not our own history, and it tends to be regurgitated over and over again in different forms. Like, I could learn about a word in my in sophomore year right now, but give college, I can learn about it again, but I still haven't learned critical race theory and what it is to grow up as a black person in America or have their side of history, not just the slavery bit, because I also feel like that's a part of white history, but having our own struggle to greatness story in place as a conversation in a classroom.
All right, so if you are part of our viewing audience and you're live streaming this, we want you to start jotting down some questions because we're going to have an opportunity to ask the panelists some questions that you've come up with or some curiosities and some interests that you have based on what it is that our panelists are saying. Other thoughts around that question? Should we be having these conversations in the classroom around politics and race?
I can answer to that. So I personally feel that what we learn in school, it's going to prepare us for later in our lives. It's going to prepare us for the social climate of college and our future careers. And especially many of us will go and eventually vote. And in order to do all that, we have to have a foundation. And if we don't have these conversations, once we are thrown into the real world, it becomes difficult to know how to react and how to present ourselves in these situations because we haven't been educated to the point where we know what informed decisions we should be making. And as with any other class or subject, like when you learn a math class or English class, these are also important life skills that you are going to take and you are going to apply them to your future careers. And that's why it's important that students need that as early as before college, because we are young people and we will eventually be the future generations who will help run this country. So we need this backbone to our education.
Any other thoughts? So I want to shift to our next question, which is a little interesting because it's one that I get asked about a lot in the community, and that is, what are my recommendations or my thoughts in terms of dealing with microaggressions? Some people feel that since microaggressions are sometimes unintentional, that people should just let it go or not dwell on them when they occur. Do you agree?
I think that if a microaggression is unintentional, then that means that person is unaware that they have said something that is wrong, right? So instead of using it as a time to be like, oh no, it's fine, just don't say it again, try to educate that person on why what they said was wrong and how that can affect other people who what they said affected. And they can use that to learn from what they said and learn how to be actively less bigoted than they were by saying that comment.
Other thoughts? When you hear microaggression, should you let it go? Or should you address it?
I think to piggyback off of what he said of the lack of knowledge and the lack of education on how it affected the other person, I think along with that, if after having the knowledge and after being taught the correct way to address the situation or what to say and what not to say, if the action continues to persist, it is a intentional action. And at that point, more pressing consequences, I think, should take place instead of just saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine, or just don't do it this time. If it's a consistent action, then I think that there's a deeper rooted issue than just a microaggression.
Any other comments? And so if you will allow me to take a little bit of a privilege, I started with a question, and I'll jump in and answer my own question, and so I'm going to piggyback on Braden Willenbrock's comment about understanding how others feel. Now, when I hear microaggression, I really believe that there are three ways that I can address it. One, I can say nothing. Two, I can respond immediately. Three, I cannot say nothing in that moment, but then respond at a later time. I regularly choose number three because as part of my modality, if you will, I no longer let it go, because if you don't say something, then it will persist. And if it persists, particularly for me personally in my sphere, I'm going to develop a bad disposition and relationship with the person who's saying it. And so I feel that I have a responsibility to bring it to their attention. I don't feel like I'm doing it to change anybody's mind. I just want you to know how I'm feeling about it. I don't respond immediately because based on what is said, it may trigger an emotion of anger. And I try to be very poised, because when you're having conversations about race, quite honestly, they're never comfortable. You're never going to hold hands, you're never going to sing Kumbaya. But I think it's an opportunity to be civil to each other and to try to find solutions, particularly among people who don't think like you. And I go into every situation understanding that there is an opportunity for collaboration. Some collaborative relationships just take a little more effort to build. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the way that I choose to handle it. And so everybody chooses to handle a microaggression very differently. And do I think that I have to respond all of the time? No, I don't. But in most cases, I do, because I want you to understand how your words affect others. I think collectively, for those who are viewing more specifically, one of the reasons why we have these conversations and one of the reasons why we do the work around race and equity in our schools is because we want to create change agents by the time students walk across the stage after 12th grade. And if you're going to be a change agent, then you have to be knowledgeable and skilled to be able to change the world around you. It's not enough just to get a high school diploma, but it's more than enough when you can deal with challenging situations across the span of your lives and know how to stand up and respond to them. And we think that there's a great power in that as part of the education for our students. More of a history question that we're shifting into: what are some suggestions that you have that will help all of us? This is staff, administrators, students, school committee members, community members collectively. What can help each of us to unpack race and face history?
One suggestion is we can continue having discussions like this. We can actually have discussions like this in the classroom. This ties back to the question, should race and politics be tied into the classroom? Absolutely. We're doing an injustice by not serving our students, not just reading, writing, and math. We should serve our students in every capacity that we can possibly think, which includes race and politics, and of course to unpack race and to face any type of history. So it's up to us as educators to inform our students on anything and everything, which includes race and any type of unpacking race. So, absolutely, yeah. But especially forums like these, we have to continue them any way possible. We just got to keep it going.
I feel relatively obligated to answer this question. I teach a course here called Facing History. So in the course Facing History, we do a lengthy unit on identity and how we as individuals identify with ourselves and the number of things that we use to create our own identities, and how we engage in our own identities. Of course, one of the aspects of identity is race. So we do spend a lesson on race and talking about race from not only a biological standpoint, but also from a historical standpoint. And from a biological standpoint, it is as superfluous as eye color or hair color, meaning that it doesn't change a person at all in their DNA from one to another. But then once we understand that and view race in that way, we start to take a look at the human construct of race and how it's been developed over the course of the last really 200 years, 200 to 300 years, through imperialism and slavery. But once we understand it as a human construct, I think it becomes much easier to have those conversations. If we can, compare race to something like hair color, eye color, and understand that we don't have those uncomfortable conversations about the color of our hair or the color of our eyes, and then we can start to talk about, why don't we talk more about race? Why don't we talk more or be less uncomfortable talking about it? And when we look at it from a historical standpoint and the places where, or how far it had been taken and race had been, identified as a trait that was a difference in people and how it was used, well, we can have a lot of empathy for people in current situations and look to improve those situations for people. So I think, going back to one of the first questions, it's not only that, we're intentionally creating these programs or implementing these programs, it's imperative that these programs exist and continue to flourish and continue to grow like we see here.
So if you all allow me, I'd like to kind of veer from our questions just a little bit. Since we're talking about unpacking race and facing history, for our students more explicitly, how do you feel when you're sitting in class and you're unpacking race and facing history?
Personally, I haven't had many conversations in class about race. I'm only a freshman, so I haven't taken unpacking history or facing history, and I haven't taken American identities and other classes that might focus more on race. But I know that in history, which is what the previous question was just talking about, we do briefly talk about slavery and like how that was like how it was terrible and how it shouldn't have happened. But that's all we really talk about race. And I think that we definitely do need to talk about it more because it's in racism because it's not something that should be briefly brushed over because it did have such an impact on a lot of identities in America and a lot of how America was developed as a country and how we need to address it to help stop it. Yeah, that's just kind of my.
And actually, I want to take some liberties because I'd like all of our students to answer that question.
Yeah, I can continue. I'm personally a senior, and I honestly feel that like my answer to the question would be very similar to Braden's in the sense that like I just feel in our school, because obviously like there's facing history is like a class, but a lot of those classes are classes that students elect to take. So I feel like usually the students who seek out those opportunities, they will eventually get to those discussions, but for every student, most likely they will not reach those discussions before they graduate. I personally have had probably like a few of those discussions, and sometimes they are usually prompted based on current events happening in the world, especially in the past 2 years, that have been so major that it would be almost not normal to not address it at all. And those were semi-forced conversations by like our faculty, but I found those to be very helpful and insightful because the students were very, at least in my experience, very respectful to one another and very perceptive to what everyone had to say. Obviously there's a teacher and it's a facilitated discussion, but I found those to be very interesting because I only know sometimes from my own perspective and my friend group, and most people's friend group in this high school are usually similar to each other in terms of race. So I think hearing those different perspectives and being forced to hear them, that was definitely the most like integral part of the discussion of why we need to have them.
All right, going on to our next table.
I think that it's a common denominator in all of our answers that there's not a lot of conversations about it, but when there are, I do notice a stronger reaction out of the majority than the minority in which we're talking about. I see that people like me are a lot more comfortable with the conversation and a lot more comfortable in talking about the struggles and how it hurts and what's the great parts of being who we are. And on the other end, it's I don't want to talk about it. It just makes me uncomfortable. I just don't feel comfortable talking about it. I don't want to like dwell on it. It was in the past. We shouldn't bring up things from the past. We should focus on the future. But history is the main reason why we stop certain things from happening now. And I think having those conversations are so necessary, even if it does make you uncomfortable.
All right, Iman, your thoughts?
I think we need to have those conversations definitely in class more often. A lot of times, people's reaction isn't effective enough because a lot of people don't respond to the particular topic. They feel like it's not effective enough, and we need to get the more like comfortable people more comfortable throughout that time, and see that because it's throughout history, it's going on every single day, and it's just not right to the community and how people should treat each other.
All right, so as we continue our conversation around climate, you know, it's often hard to talk about issues of race, but it's also difficult to talk about other issues that include difference. So for example, differences in class and gender and political affiliation and sexual orientation and age, religion, you know, ability, and any other type of identity. So what are your suggestions on how we can have better conversations around differences? What can we do different? What can we do better? How can we bring more people into the conversation? Even if, as Elodie mentioned, it makes people uncomfortable. Whenever you're talking about difference, there's always discomfort that's created. So how do we engage more people into these conversations?
So I always kind of look at my classroom as its own small community, 20 people. And coming from a place of empathy, having once been in a high school classroom, I think that there's no more uncomfortable situation than when a teacher calls on you for an answer that you didn't want to give, no matter what the topic is. But once that becomes part of the community norm, you know, being a student being called on, for instance, or other students calling on each other, every day you come in, you're more and more comfortable in that situation. You know what to expect. I think with differences, race, class, gender, et cetera, to go off what Mr. Pittman said earlier, it takes somebody to look in the mirror to understand those differences. And I think the first thing that we all need to do is start to understand how we identify as individuals, to list out everything that makes us us, every single aspect of ourselves. And we'd find that there isn't one other person in this planet that is the way that you are, or that I am, or anybody else is. So if we start to realize that we can never fully understand what it is to be somebody else, and that there are multiple aspects that make you as an individual who you are, we can understand that we're all different. And those differences are actually perfect. And if we can start to understand those things in a community setting and have more conversations about those differences and ask questions and, you know, ask people what it is like to be them and have them ask what it is like to be you. Well, just in the same situation where coming into a classroom every day that you started to feel more comfortable with having conversations about other topics, these topics will also become much more comfortable for individuals. You know, not just in a 20-person classrooms community, but in much larger communities as we continue to have these conversations here.
Other comments?
I'd like to piggyback off of that by saying I think that we should introduce more classes that talk about different types of identities that like can go more in depth than what a history class could, or what even using little things like reading passages that introduce different identities in English, or talking about different identities in different classes and trying to integrate that into curriculums. I think that actually creating classes that can go more in depth than what most other classes and courses can, and then having those be a necessity to take. I don't know how we can do that, but I think that would be a good way to try to destigmatize talking about different types of identities. And I think a big thing is that it really isn't widely talked about in schools, different like other identities. And due to that, there's a stigma and that's why people are uncomfortable, because we don't talk about it, like he said. And being able to destigmatize that by introducing these courses and introducing different things in different classes is going to be able to help us talk about these conversations more freely.
Any other comments? Responses to the question?
I think that as much as we can implement new classes and new curriculums and after-school clubs and activities to talk about all the problems, whether it be sexual orientation, race, anything that falls underneath that. It's, as Mr. Pittman and Mr. Casey said, it falls under self. We are at a point where a lot of people are actually talking, as though it doesn't seem like it, but not a lot of people are listening. And it takes a lot of personal knowledge or self-awareness to know that there's a problem, and that if I'm listening and the person next to me is listening, then we can have a conversation, because a conversation is talking and listening and actively listening. Without listening, it's just talking. And I think without that self-awareness and the presence of self, then we can't move further in a conversation, and it will make us uncomfortable, because now you're introducing something that you're already rejecting. You've not taken the time to understand it.
Any final comments? And so I want to shift our attention, if you will, into our third section, which is reach and impact. Reach meaning how do you reach others, and the impact referring to the type of effect that you want to have on others. How do you engage with people who have different backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences than you do? And so just thinking about your day-to-day activities here at BHS, how do you engage with people who are different?
I think we are engaging, but we're doing it on a surface level. We're not going deeper. We say hi to everybody, but we don't know what they're about. We don't know what their weekend was about. We don't know anything about them. So I think we just have to get deeper, and that goes, again, with the person in the mirror. Do you want to get deeper? I think you should. So don't just say, hello, how was your weekend? Really care about it. Really ask about how was your week. What did you do? And throw your views on whatever the comment is about. So the answer is just go deeper. Just don't have a surface conversation. Just go deeper.
Other thoughts?
Kind of answer. I think when we've been talking a little bit before about like discomfort, I think there's can be sometimes like a fear, I think definitely among students, of probably saying the wrong thing in terms of asking a question that is worded impolitely, or it comes off as like inconsiderate. And I think the best way to like alleviate that tension is just to basically like ask a person to tell them more about themselves and who they are, what they like to do, what their interests are, what they do outside of school, because then they can start sharing more about those differences that someone may want to ask but are too afraid to get straight to it. And then by having those conversations, I think you will eventually learn how to respectfully talk about those subjects. And I think if we start with the more general questions, if we kind of build into it, and if we show a person that we're interested and we genuinely care about who they are, I think then we will be able to form better connections with people who are different.
Any other comments? And so, you know, the world encompasses thousands of languages and experiences, multiracial and interclass. But our upbringing, family, friends, churches from which we develop our worldviews, are often not as diverse. How do you have difficult conversations with the people that you're most familiar? How do you have those difficult conversations with the people you're closest to? And particularly, if you've heard them use microaggressions or language that's contrary to your discussions in a more diverse environment, how do you deal with that? How do you address it? What do you say?
I can answer again. I would just say that even if you're close with someone, and even if they're like your closest friend, the part of addressing, it should be no different from if they're your closest friend or if they're a stranger, because ultimately what the act is, if it's a microaggression, it's the same and it will have the same impact. And if anything, we should feel comfortable to be that person to tell them what they're doing, because if we're someone that's close to them and if we say it, and they won't have to deal later on, hopefully, with a person that they don't know telling them what they're doing that's affecting someone else, and they won't continue with those microaggressions. And I think sometimes people might think that if someone's a friend, that it doesn't, what they do might not affect them, but I think that is important that we have those conversations within our friend groups, because that's how we are just going to, you know, I would say like approach those people who are different from us, because we need to check the people around us and make sure that not only us, like we're not the only person who's treating people with differences properly, but we need to make sure that our surrounding circle is also doing the same as well. And that's kind of our responsibility as a student or teacher, is to make sure that we kind of have a community where everyone feels included and everyone feels equal.
I think it's more easy said than done, trying to have those conversations, especially when it comes to family. I know, because I'm from an immigrant family, and values and the way that they do things where they're from is so completely different than how we do it here. And growing up here, I'm almost the opposite of what they look at as normal. So when I try to introduce new ideas, they are defensive because it's new. And I said, like I said earlier, when we don't know things, we tend to get scared of it. So I think that it's not the best idea to slam it all at them at once, like, no, don't do this, it's not good. But maybe one thing at a time so they realize how it feels, because saying it's not good is one thing, but really expressing how you feel and how the action made you feel will get a different reaction out of them. It's really difficult, especially when you know that's not what they're used to. So I think that would be a better way to approach it.
I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the groups that we feel a part of are the least diverse groups. People feel more comfortable, you know, talking to people in the same language, right, or with the same interests. And generally speaking, those that are around you are the ones that are going to be the most like you. And as reading this question, it became very difficult for me to answer, because thinking about, you know, my own experiences, probably having to should have had those conversations within those groups, certain individual people, and then not, and then understanding that, you know, being a part of that group is important to me, and also, you know, remaining a part of that group is important to me. And I think people feel like if they stand out within that group and say, you know, say something to somebody that, you know, hey, that wasn't right, what you said wasn't right, or we should talk about what you just said. It's going back to the microaggressions question, for example. I think they're fearful they're going to be kicked out of that group, that they're not going to be welcomed anymore, or they're going to be disliked within that group. And I think perhaps that's the most important place for us as individuals to say something, to be, you know, the person that stands up and says, hey, what you said wasn't right, or you know, we should talk about this. And I think ironically what ends up happening in those situations is you actually become more revered in that group, as, you know, up against the fear of not being so. So yeah, again, it's one of those questions to have difficulty with, because you can think back in your own situations and oh, I should have said something this time. I should have done something here and I didn't. And to moving forward to have those impacts within your groups, I think is probably the most important thing to do.
So to piggyback on Mr. Casey's comment, whenever you hear a racist comment or witness harassment in any form, is it always necessary to intervene or say something? And this is for any of you.
Just from my upbringing, thank you. My family, we've always been the person to outspeak, to speak whatever, speak our mind. So I think I took that from my parents to, if I see something, I'll say something. Even before it was a famous saying, we've always did that. If we see something wrong, we'll go ahead and say it. And I think it just came from my sports background. We come from a family that it's all about winning. It's all about keeping our eyes on the prize. It's all about welcoming people. So it's not about dissing people. It's not about having people at arm's length. It's about welcoming people. And if you see something, say something. Yeah.
Any other comments? And this is our last question before we open up the space for audience participation. So whether you're here in person or whether you're streaming, if you have a question or you have a comment, something that's on your mind, something that you've been thinking about regarding some of the topics that we covered today, we want you to feel free enough to put that comment in the chat or that question, and if you're in person, to ask it while you're here as well. Any other final comments?
I think after, much more recently, we've seen the impact of long-term harassment on individuals, especially young people. And I think with that understanding, it is ever more important to say something when it's witnessed, even one time. I think from an individual standpoint, we have to acknowledge a situation if we feel that, intervening would put our own health at risk. Then it's important to know where to go to say something. Either if you're a student, to go to a trusted adult, an adult to go to another adult, or a superior, in order to say something about it, to make sure it's addressed. Also, where a majority of racist comments and harassment in today's day and age isn't happening out in the open, we're faced with a situation where we don't see the results of most of it as a community until it's too late, which makes it even more important when it's witnessed in places like social media and online, that something is said about that immediately. Because if you're witnessing it one time, it's probably happening multiple times across multiple platforms. So I think, like I said, in today's day and age, it's becoming ever more apparent that something needs to be done, and ever more important for something to be said and done in these situations.
All right, so I want to give the audience an opportunity to comment and respond. Ms. Sudak, let me start by asking if there are any comments or questions in the chat. And as you are looking for those comments and questions, for those who are in person, is there a question? Ms. Taylor, shall I bring you the mic?
First of all, thank you. I learned a lot listening to you, but I'm going to ask a principal question, because this is the kind of questions they put in leadership classes for principals anyway. So if you were a stranger coming into Beverly High School and just walking through it for a little bit, we talk about climate and culture. What are the things you see or hear or feel that makes you sense that this is a good climate at a school? What are the look-fors?
Not everyone all at once.
I think the most important thing to look for is to see people who, of all types of people, pretty much every student that's coming to school, they look like they are comfortable walking in the hallways, and look like they feel safe going to their class or talking to a fellow student or even a teacher if need be. I think that's very important, because we want to make sure that every student feels safe in this environment, because school is a place that you can come to every day, and you should be able, your primary focus should be to learn, to get an education. And I do think for a new person walking into the building, they should feel that regardless of their identity or who they are, that they will find a group of people who will accept them, and they will be able to come to school every day feeling like they can learn and do that in an environment where they can speak up and participate and be with their classmates.
Other thoughts, comments? Questions to the question.
I know that I came from a predominantly white middle school, and it was a smaller classroom setting. But even with the smaller classroom setting, I still didn't feel like I was a part of it. I felt like I was on the outside looking into every discussion or every interaction that friend groups had. I wasn't really a part of. I was just kind of watching it. And looking at new schools, I knew what I wanted to see. I knew that when I walked into the doors, if I could at least see one group that felt like community, then I knew I could go to the school. I feel like going into the school and you see that there's seclusion, and yes, everyone is an individual in their own entity, but if everyone's just walking solo and there's no connection, then I feel like personally I couldn't go there, because it's a human-to-human connection kind of thing, not just one person alone.
Questions or comments in that chat? Oh, yes, sir.
From a teacher's perspective, we always want to give the students as much as possible so they'll win. So when I first started here, I always looked for what are teachers doing to help the students be successful. And that's what the culture here at BHS, it's all about giving the students what they need to be successful. So I feel comfortable on going to the administrator and say, hey, we need this because it's for our students. And then it's in motion. So it's about giving the students what they need and preparing the teachers so we can service them.
Should I bring a mic down? All right.
It's actually just comments about the panel. And just a few viewers at home just wanted to say these kids are so smart. They're relieved that they are in a school community committed to intentional work around anti-racism. Also, dealing with microaggression keeps all kids safe, gives all kids tools to be successful. And then great positivity here in the chat, but big thing was such valuable perspectives you all have brought, and they all appreciate that, and I do as well as a member of this community. So.
Comments, questions from our in-person audience? Should I bring a mic to you? All right.
Comments I want to make. I'm Paul Willenbrock. I'm relatively new to Beverly. I've been only here 47 years. And I have been on the Race Equity Committee in Beverly. I want to make these comments. One is I really appreciate everybody's remarks tonight. You two were brilliant. You all were good, but you two were really brilliant, okay? I'm sorry. You were great too, but don't worry. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, as this gentleman said, we should have these discussions not only here, but in the classroom. I wanted to broaden it and say that the whole Beverly community should have them. We should have Beverly members out here, okay? Okay. The other thing I want to say, as a member of the Race Equity Committee, and I know this is way off target now, but as a member of the Race Equity Committee, the mayor and the police chief know that I'm aghast that we're so undiverse in Beverly. We have more and more people of color coming into Beverly, but one single black person on the police force. Very few teachers in Beverly are black, and hardly any black owners in Beverly. And that is a big problem for me. I'd like to see much more diversity, not just people coming in, but right to the top. And I was the one that voted for the black mayor of Beverly. I would have liked to have seen a black mayor. Now, I've said enough, but that's it.
did just get another question, actually, from another member of our Race Equity Task Force. If you could make one change today, what would it be? Here.
Just one. One change. Anybody? One change. I don't know. That's a good one. Can't pick one?
All right. If I can make one change, what would it be?
So me as superintendent of schools, right? If I could make one change that might impact some of the things that you talked about, some of the things that you brought forward, what would that be? Or what could it be? Or something that we should be thinking of?
I think we bring this discussion to the classroom. We have advisory every week, so let's start utilizing that time. We have the students captured, so we have their attention for a few minutes, so let's start utilizing that time.
I think, so I think with these conversations, it's very difficult to have every teacher have the comfortability speaking about these things, maybe perhaps that I do or Mr. Pittman does. You know, I've taught my course for a number of years here, and I've had a lot of training in that, taken a number of professional development courses in that course and in these topics. And I think that if staff had those same opportunities, maybe not to that extent, but had those same opportunities, they would feel more comfortable talking about it in their own classroom settings. When we're talking about an advisory, you know, a 21-minute, 22-minute advisory, you know, and I'm not going to pick on a certain, you know, curriculum here, but say a math teacher isn't comfortable talking about that as much as a history teacher would be, and I can empathize and understand that. I feel like if they were more comfortable, if they had that training, it would make it a lot easier for the entire staff, and I think you'd see some real results.
All right, we have time for one more comment before we close out for the evening. One change you like to make, you like to see.
In just talking about like the discussion aspect, I feel like that's really important to bring to our classroom in terms of like, you know, most students probably don't feel the same discomfort that a discussion would bring if they had to write a paper or if they had to like take a test on these difficult conversations because it's individualized and they're just doing their own work. But I think is to incorporate these more face-to-face interactions in the classroom, and I would say in as much as possible, an advisory when there's obviously sometimes class periods where there's opportunity for that if presented, especially with certain English and history topics. So I think it's definitely to use discussion more effectively because it is effective. And even though not every student is the type who will want to talk, we want to get them to a place where they are.
As I look at the time, we've gone over just a little bit, and so I like to bring it to the close, but help me to appreciate Reginald Pittman, Braden Willenbrock, Olivia Ehrenberg, Paul Casey, Iman Patel, and Elodie LaPointe for joining us this evening. I want to thank our in-person attendees and also those who have joined us virtually for being in this conversation. Our next community conversation was going to be held at the McEwen School on Tuesday, May the 23rd, 6:30 p.m., and we will get the information out to you in the next week. So we look forward to the continued conversations and for you joining us. Have a great evening.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. You guys were phenomenal. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Yvonne. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Thank you, my dear. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Who's treating?